Hello everyone, this is the tutorial for my flare assembler node. I've used plenty of different lens flare plugins over the time, and what I notice is that they all generate flares, except optical flares, and this is usually pretty slow and render intensive. So my idea was, what if I had the assets already rendered out and I can just plug them into a node and the node assembles them in a way that they move like lens flare. And this is exactly what I did. And the cool thing about it is that it really renders fast compared to these other nodes. It can still get very heavy because it supports motion blur, but still it's way faster and you can even use it in your script live. Let's go into it. When you connect your viewer, you're going to see that there are a lot of gizmos, which is very annoying. So it makes sense just to hover over the viewer and press Q to get rid of all them. Then you're going to see the guide frame. You can turn it on here, because if you don't have it, you have no clue where your format is, so this is why I built it. Also, you have the ruler here. We're going to use it later to explain some functions, and it's very useful for setting up certain things inside the node, but for now you can just ignore it. So let's build out a little lens flare. I'm just going to connect the inputs to some assets I have here, and you already see they are being assembled in a lens flare way. Now as we change the center, the lens flare moves. Then we have the fading options. So let's move the lens flare all the way to the left. The fading options work like this. The 200 means 200 pixels from the format. That means if I move the flare 200 pixels over here, it will be completely faded out when it reaches 200 pixels. So let's do that. Let's put a 10. And now as we move the flare, you see it starts to fade out. And once I reach 200 here, the flare is completely gone. So you can change that to fade out longer if you want. So if I put 300 here now, it's gone. And now it slowly comes back. Then you have additional controls with the offset fade, which means, let's go back to 200. If the flare is at 200, but I want the flare not to start fading out on the format border, instead I want it to start earlier with fading or later, you can put that here. So if we put the offset fade to 20 and I move the flare minus 20, it will still be fully visible, and from now on take 200 pixels to completely fade out. The next fading option is the occlusion input, and this one lets you take an alpha, like from a CG, and you can use that alpha to drive the opacity of the flare. So you don't have to do any manual animating of opacity, you can just use the occlusion input. So let's view the flare and then connect the occlusion input to my CG object, and then let's enable this input. Keep this input disabled if you're not using the occlusion mask, because your console might show up errors otherwise. I couldn't fix that yet, but I will probably, but it doesn't do any harm, so don't worry about it. Okay, and then I'm going to merge the flare assemble on top of the CG. Now let's move the flare center to the CG. And you see already that when it reaches the alpha, it starts fading off. So dependent on the alpha's density, the flare will fade. So it will actually do half transparencies as well as semi-transparencies. To control it further, there are some things you can do. So let's talk about this edge here. The lens flare starts now has a fall off, so it doesn't fade very quickly because I put in some stuff here. The fall off is applying a blur to the alpha. That means we don't just have 5 pixels of anti-aliasing, we get like 10, 15. So the flare has like 15 pixels range until it's faded out. The problem with that is that the flare, when it moves inside the object, is still visible on top, which is bad. So with a shift occlusion, you can counter this and expand the blurred alpha so that the flare is already gone. And now we get a very smooth transition that looks very nice. Then we have the lens controls. First of all, you have focus shift. So in case you want to animate the focus shifting, you can do that here. With that slider, you can adjust the pieces scale. So there's a Sinus function going on, so the piece gets bigger and then smaller again, and I built in a little offset for randomness. So if you don't like the look of this, you can animate this slider instead of the focus slider. And with that, with the second one, you multiply the value of the first one. So 0 equals the original state of the pieces, and then you can multiply it. So what you could do is basically get any flare look you want in that slider and then just animate this one to fade to it if you want to. And then we have a focal length change, which you can enable, and then the flare is zoomed in. The next function is the edge pop. You might have noticed that on some flares, when they reach the edge of the format, they suddenly get very bright for a little moment. There's a mask that's driving the edge pop, and everything within that mask will have a very strong glare for that moment. You can adjust the mask size here and the mask softness as well. And you have a range control here, which means right now it's set to 20 pixels, which means right here the edge pop is going to have its full brightness, and 20 pixels to the right it will be on normal brightness again. And also from here outside the format there's 20 pixels of range. So by increasing that, your edge pop will last longer and not pop that quickly. So then I enabled the overscan, and after that I made a strong lens distortion. So what you see is that there is my mathematical center, but the asset is actually here because of the lens distortion. That means that the edge pop is also happening right here, but it should be happening there. But you can change that. So if I hover over here, I can see that the position is like 30 pixels on X. So what I could do is take the pop offset, which is set to outwards now, so it will offset the edge pop outwards, and set it to 30. And now, when I move the flare as 30 pixels negative and it reaches here, we will see the edge pop happening. So, and there's the edge pop. The same thing works for inwards as well if you have a lens distortion that is the other way around. In the next tab, we come to the center elements. We have a general control, which controls all three of them, and then you have individual controls for each of them. So I connected one of them, and you have a bunch of options here, which you can see, but we have some special options as well. So let's add a second flare. Let's add this one, and enable flare 3. This asset is now on the same position as the main flare, but I wanted to shift on this axis but stay on the height of this flare. So let me show you what I mean. So if I mirror this asset's movement on the y-axis, I have this flare counter moving to the other one, which looks very anamorphic, so you can quickly build very nice stuff with that. You could also mirror it in both directions or just X and get very weird results, but could be useful, so I built it in. Then we have also the rotation. So let's go to center 2 and enable the rotation. Right now the asset is rotated and it will rotate based on its distance to the format center. That looks like this. And you have full control on how much. By default this is set to 1, so you have a very gentle movement, and you can go even lower if you wanted to. You can also invert the rotation and get all kinds of results. Next up, let's go to the pieces themselves. You have 3 pieces inputs, and a general control for all of them at once as well. So let's disable flare 2 and 3 and just play with the first one. You have full control where you put it. You could even put it behind the center and it will still work just fine. You can scale it, and apart from the position that it has on this axis, you can still offset it the way you want it to. So if I put in a crazy number here, it's kind of offset, but it's still moving in the right way. So you could build a random lens flare. And then you have special options. So first of all, let's scale this asset in width to get a crazier result. And now we could enable aim at center. So no matter how that thing moves, it will always aim at the center. And here comes the problem. As you see, we get a very ugly turn here. And you can counter this by using the fade towards center. So let's enable it. It gives you a percentage. This means 30%. So if we look here, here's 100%. There's exactly 10 dots, so this is 30%. When the asset has this distance from the format center, it will start fade out and stop at 15%, which would be here. And this we can see here. And this makes the transition very gentle. You can you can put in values here from 0 to 100 because it's percent. And what you can also do is swap the values. So if I put the 15 here and the 30 there, it will not fade out towards center. It will only be visible in the center and not when it moves further away. Then we have also the relative scale, which means the asset will scale up as it reaches the edge of the format. And you have different controls here. You have quadratic, which means it just has a gentler curve, and cubic will have a very, very eased effect, like a horizontal interpolation. Then we have the relative stretch, which is absolutely the same as relative scale, but limited to one axis. So you will just have a change in one axis, which you can also invert if you want it, and you get a stretch then. Next up, we have the copy pieces tab. The flares themselves just give you 3 inputs, so 3 flares. So I made this copy pieces so that these 3 get copied multiple times to quickly populate that entire flare. That means that all the changes that you made to, for example, flare 1 will also be in the flare 1 copies. So if you want to build a very huge lens flare with a lot of pieces, you might have to use multiple of these assembler nodes to do that. So now let's enable copy 1 and get rid of the relative stretch. And this one still has individual control over its scale. So its base scale is going to be the original flare scale, but you can still scale it and position it as you want. And this is where it gets very nice, because if I position that right here, like that, and maybe blurred, and I change that operation to minimum or multiply, I can cut off that flare, and in movement we get a proper shaped flare, cut flare. Okay, we are done with all the assets that you can add, but there are some more tabs which are pre-built things that don't require any asset, because getting certain effects with an asset is more difficult than just having it pre-built. Let's start with the rainbow here. And you have, of course, a bunch of options. So you can break up that pattern, which will create this ray effect. And by default, if it moves, you can see that the rays are actually changing frame by frame based on its position. You could switch that off by unchecking animate. Now we have different scaling options. First of all, we have the global scale. And then we have the oval shape, which just makes that whole thing oval. And as we play it, you see this thing is always aiming at the center no matter what. You cannot turn that off because for the rainbow it just makes sense. And as you see, the turning around the center is very rapid. That's why I would recommend having the fade towards center always on. It works as the other fade center options. So at 60%, which is here, it will start fading off, and at 20% it's completely faded out. You could as well switch them, and the acid would fade in from here, but I wouldn't recommend it. What you could also do is split the scale and give the flare a lot of width, and then you get a very anamorphic looking rainbow. Important is, if you want it to look good, set the oval shape back to 1, because if you still have it on, it will look weird because it's halfly stretched and half aiming, and I find that very odd. So just set it to 1, and then you will have a nice look. Lastly, we have some options. So you could drop the saturation and now give it any color you want with the gain to achieve any look you want. And you have the offset color, which just shifts the general colors of the flare to give you more flexibility on what you're going for. The remaining options are the same that you know from the pieces already. Relative scale works exactly the same, and relative stretch as well. Now let's talk about the shimmer elements. With them I try to rebuild the flaring that happens on the edges of the format. So let's enable this. There's some stuff you can do here. We have the cut outside, and you can adjust that here with the cut softness, and also you can offset the cut. Then we could add an outline, which just gives a very thin line, which you can control here. And then if you add color shift, you can get a very nice looking edge, which is just more interesting. To make that now very nice, let's add some movement to that whole shimmer element. Let's start with the move relative checker. Once this is turned on, the shimmer will move relatively to the flare center. Let's play it and watch. Right now we have that. You could invert the movement, so the shimmer moves with the flare, but in an offset way. You can control that here. With strength at 1, the flare is not moving much. With 0, it will just stay in place. And as we increase this, the flare is gonna travel further. Now if we enable the second element as well, we can use that offset shapes slider here. And that will make the shapes move relative to each other as well. And you can control that here. By setting this to 0, we have one flare not moving at all, the other one is. And the higher the numbers get here, the more offset you will have between them, which lets you build very nice effects. Lastly, we can use the occlusion mask to cut off certain sections of the shimmer elements. So let's enable it. Basically, the occlusion mask is the same as the shimmer, but it's inverted, and it will cut away sections. So right now, as we play it, see that certain sections of the shimmer are cut away. So let's increase the scale and see more effect. And you could again invert the movement, so you get a different areas that are masked away. Here we have the density of the cutout mask. So by increasing and decreasing this, you can cut away even more. And the mix controls the overall density of the mask. It's kind of a multiplier for that density slider. The last tab is about the bloom. Let's enable it. And what the bloom does is, as you go towards the center, the whole frame will brighten up. You can control that again with the fade from center, so it's starting at 80 and fully faded in at 20, and you can adjust everything about it.